We would like to open today's webinar by acknowledging the land that we are gathered on here today and expressing our gratitude for its critical connection to the health of all. This land acknowledgement has been formulated for Toronto, where the head office of Park People sits. However, please remember that a land acknowledgement is a personal recognition of who you are and your relationship to the land on which you find yourself, and thus your responsibility to that land. With this in mind, if you're located anywhere that is not Toronto, I do encourage you to make this land acknowledgement personal to you. Park People acknowledges that the land they call home sits on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. The Dish with One Spoon Agreement describes the sharing of land amongst two or more nations. It signifies that people are all eating out of a single dish and that the dish is the shared territory. One spoon signifies that all peoples sharing the territory are expected to limit the resources that they take in order to leave enough for others and for the continued abundance and viability of these resources into the future. In the context of today's discussion, it feels especially important to recognize the legacy of Indigenous displacement that has led to the creation of many urban parks and public spaces, and the historical role of urban planning in settler colonialism and dispossession. As we discuss the future within the context of parks and public spaces, it's important for us to reflect on the knowledge, the policies, and the practices of the past and the present that continue to regulate and oppress Indigenous relationships to land. In this conversation and in our work, it is our responsibility to guide and implement practices and policies that uphold and restore Indigenous relationships to land. We hope that this acknowledgement invites us all to reflect on the ongoing colonial injustices in our park systems and brings that awareness to our conversation today. Today, I am joining you from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I invite you to introduce yourself in the chat window with your name, your organization, and the nation's territory you're visiting us from. If you don't know which nation's territory you live or work in, we will post the links to nativeland.ca or Whose Land, both of which share the territories of Indigenous peoples from across the world. So we have Adam, who will be moderating today's session. So I'm going to hand it over to him to lead us, and I'll see you in a few minutes. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Molly. I'm very excited to be with you all today, and I see folks from all across Turtle Island joining in and letting us know where they are coming in from. We have actually five lovely panelists with us today that I'd like to introduce for you in a moment, but I also just want to reiterate what Molly said about our obligations. Some of us, most of us as treaty people here, and I think the conversation we'll have today about space and about how we share that space, we'll definitely get into that. So I mentioned we have five lovely panelists with us today. Joining us from the West Coast, we have Sarah Common and Ali Kenny from Hives for Humanity. Sarah is the ED at Hives for Humanity, and Ali is, I gather, one who knows it all and does it all at Hives for Humanity. They are both passionate about their community and about empowering their local community through their work. I'll leave it up to them to describe a little bit more about exactly what it is they do in a moment, because it's a very interesting model. We also have Rebecca Till from the Vancouver Parks Board, who, like others, it does a bit of everything, or has done a bit of everything, is currently managing a consultant team to update the Park Board's local food action plan. And it's kind of funny, I think we had set out to talk about, creative activation in our parks, and we stumbled into four or five folks who all kind of focus on food, completely unintentionally. But I think it's an interesting note that food is a really good way of bringing people together. Next, we have Leslie Campbell from FoodShare, based in Toronto. Leslie's work focuses on food insecurity, and Leslie's currently managing FoodShare's special projects, of which there are now many. Especially over the last 10 months. So he'll have some lovely notes to share there. And last but not least, we have Sabina Ali from the Thorncliffe Park Women's Committee. Sabina is a park organizer and the executive director of the TPWC, who's also had some interesting interesting initiatives related to food and markets in her community. You may have heard about her and the tandoor oven that they crowdsourced in Thorncliffe Park to build. So what I'm going to do is let our panelists get into it. I'm going to ask each of them to give us just a few minutes about their work, and especially about how their work has changed since the COVID pandemic began, and any ways that they've had to adapt. Once everybody's given a few kind of introductory remarks, we'll have a conversation about really what the role of parks in our communities could be and should be, and how we can support that vision. So Sarah and Ali, if you're ready, I'll turn it over to you to kick us off.
Thanks so much, Adam and Molly, for the introduction, and all the co-panelists for being here, and all the guests too. It's exciting to be gathering during this time, coming together on this online way, when perhaps in other times we would be in our gardens or around a big dining table sharing food. Yeah, my name's Sarah. I'm here with Ali. We're on unceded land of Musqueam and Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh nations in Vancouver. We work in the downtown east side of Vancouver with Hives for Humanity Society. And we work together to create meaningful opportunities for connection to land and food and community for our urban folks who are experiencing poverty, who are experiencing the housing crisis, who are experiencing the drug policy crisis, and who are experiencing this pandemic too, which is layering like already isolated community members, layering more isolation on top. So we've been really grateful to our gardens and to our bees in giving us ways to still gather and allowing us to adjust and adapt and learn. Learn from all of these crises and grow together. So yeah, we moved into smaller teams and we moved away from more public facing work, and we've really been focusing on our core group of folks. Ali is one of those folks who's a leader and a kokum for our community, a grandmother. Ali, do you want to introduce yourself too?
I don't know if some of the people never heard exactly who I am, but I go by Ali. I worked for the Women's Center, and then I also became a volunteer for Sarah's business. But as well, I used to work in the daycare, and I did construction. So I got transplanted here from over there to here. And I raised my family here in Vancouver, and so that's the reason why I'm electing to stay here. When we were talking about some of the questions that came to mind about parks, we have a park here in Vancouver. It's called Andy Livingston Park, but the code name is called the Duck Pond. And the Duck Pond is now the city had not allowed the water to come, so there's no ducks. I think once we saw one in language in the Ojibwe, for duck is a shishib, and I remember eating it when I was a kid, and it was, really good food. So the thing about this park is one of my elders told me that the trees are actually not even from here. Some of the trees are actually from back east. I go to one park at Stanley Park where they have a tree that's called an arbutus tree. Arbutus tree also grows on the islands when you're sailing from Vancouver to Washington State. And that's where I go to pray. That's my tree, and I pray for, good reasons. And I was really intrigued by that tree because it loses its bark, but it comes back every year. We have a garden at Chartrand. You'll see those images. We have the folk garden, which is to me is like a little mini jungle, and the elders like to come and sit there because that's their way from their little tiny rooms that they live in. We also have a garden called the Astoria Garden, and that's where we plant the flowers for the bees. I think I covered all the bases.
That was awesome, Ali. Thanks. Thank you, Adam. Thanks for having us, everyone.
Sarah, did you want to share a couple visuals and share a couple examples of your work while we have you?
Sure. Yeah. That should be coming through for everyone. This is actually Allie here, where my little cursor is. She kind of blends into this huge sky scene and city scene and mountain scene and garden scene. This is Soul Food Urban Farms. Soul Food is this is one of the biggest urban farms in Canada, actually, I think, and we have a small apiary there. So we've been partnered with Soul Food for a couple of years to offer some pollination through the honeybees and also some education and connection between our organizations. And Ali, I don't know if you want to say anything about this photo, do you?
Oh, well, I really, she caught me off guard. I didn't know I was being photographed. And I think I was very impressed when the person that was actually, I don't recall his name right now, but he was actually talking away and he was just filling in for another person. He knows how to work computer spreadsheets, and I was listening to him, very, attentively, I might add. And so, I've seen that part of the land change, and I was very impressed that they had all of this. They have modular housing there where the people that live there can actually work in those gardens and gain some work experience, the young people. So I was very happy to see that, or hear about that news and actually see things going on. I was happy to see these, I would say they looked like old hippies from that generation with their grandkids as we were working, towards the bees. They were gazing at us, behind a chain link fence. So I thought that was there's always people wanting to learn about what we do. I think it's a very important thing that's happening in that area.
Yeah, and this is an image of one of our apiaries, two of our other beekeepers, Ian in the white full bee suit and Jim there with the frame of bees. And this is actually at our Hastings Folk Garden, which Ali spoke to, which is right beside Insight, the supervised injection site, right near the Carnegie Library at Main and Hastings, this real center of the city where we have this small garden that Ali was describing as a jungle, where there's lots of spaces to sit and room for people to come in, and where volunteers from the downtown east side open it. And yeah, the smoke from our smoker wafting up there, the bees flying around in this jungle of vines, as well as the sweet honey, and as well as the opportunities for volunteering and work. These are all the ways that we try and reach out to community and welcome them in and create these opportunities to really feel when we hold the bees, and to really feel when we care for the seeds, through to the flowers, through to the food, that we then get to share all of that and really make tangible our interconnection, to the land and to the air and to the water and to the winged and the four-footed and all the other beings, all the ways of knowing and being that exist in our communities. And I'll share more later, I think, but I think that's good for now.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there, and I love that idea of the urban jungle, and like you mentioned, in particular in the downtown east side, next to a historic site, next to the Insight facility. I think we'll get into a bit of a conversation about the importance of that and some of the intersections there later. But I'll turn it over to Rebecca. I know, Rebecca, you know Sarah and Ali from before, and you might have some interesting kind of broad policy take coming from the Vancouver Parks Board.
Yeah, thank you. And it was nice to hear you speak. I could listen to Ali tell stories for a while. So yeah, I just give a little Vancouver context. As Sarah and Ali mentioned, we're on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and the Park Board in Vancouver is has its own elected board. So that's unique in Canada, one of the only park boards in Canada like that. And that Park Board is working to develop strong relationships with MST as an ongoing priority. We steward 230 public parks, and there's a lot of increasing density and population in Vancouver. And Vancouver is one of the most, if not the most, unaffordable city in North America. And so the demand on parks and the ability to meet the increase in population is quite a challenge. And then in terms of the policy that guides some of the work I'm going to talk about, I just want to mention Van Play. It's a guiding work, a piece of plan. And what I think is important for this conversation is that Van Play acknowledges the history of resources and services being unevenly distributed to areas of the city where those with more privilege and power have been able to advocate for access to parks and services. And so the plan specifically has a direction around delivering services equitably in future. And one of the ways that VanPlay will aim to do that is equity initiative zone maps that are meant to prioritize resources and service delivery in future to areas that have typically and historically been underserved. And another guiding policy and work is Park Board's commitment to reconciliation, which is a priority around decolonizing the Park Board. And one of the ways in which we do that is as led by our reconciliation planner, is to do colonial audits on pieces of policy and procedure. And they're an excellent way to look at our colonial thinking from the past and sort of highlight the way in which we have been doing work that we can, once we can see it in those old plans, that's the way in which we know how we can decolonize it for future plans. And so in my work that relates to the update of the Park Board's local food action plan. So a local food action plan was written in 2013, and the plan deals with all kinds of food assets and services that the Park Board sort of stewards. And so we have, that goes from community gardens, sharing educational gardens, native plant gardens, fruit and nut trees. We have 24 community centers that offer food programs and meal programs. There's kitchen facilities for community kitchen work. There's markets, that's farmers markets to affordable produce markets, concessions, cafes, and community food hubs. So there's all kinds of ways that food touches park space and public space in the way that we kind of interact with food and land. And so one of the priorities that we've pre-outlined with the update of the local food action plan is that will fall in line with the priorities of VanPlay, so that we're looking at the allocation of food assets and services in future, and currently will go to areas that have been underserved, these equity initiative zones. And also in looking at the colonial definitions of the word, of the term for food assets, is often defined as with an emphasis on built infrastructure rather than indigenous and food and plant medicines, and looking at what is inherent in the land and how, and if we're not considering those things in the way that we define food assets, then what are we missing when we're planning for those things? And also the way in which we permit use of land. I mean, when you're on unceded territories and then a colonial institution is permitting use of land, that's inherently colonial, and so that's something that there's a review on and how we look at land. And yeah, since COVID, there's just been the increase in demand in parks is for all kinds of uses has been seen. Places for gathering, for food growing, for cultural practice, for play, for exercise. I mean, these outdoor spaces have a huge demand. And I think there's been a number of responses that we can get into later that the Park Board has had around food specifically during COVID, turning some park sites into food growing sites. Staff have grown food to go towards meal programs and hamper programs, and the golf course kitchens have started cooking food for meal programs in the downtown east side. Extra funding and staff time was put towards Indigenous land-based practitioners, and there's a community food fund that's meant for community groups working from underserved communities, and that was all given towards the food response. And yeah, so we'll just get into more of those details later, and I'll leave it at there for now.
Yeah, there's so much in there. I'm going to turn it over to Leslie because I think, Leslie, the idea of reimagining how we use parks with COVID is something you've been thinking about, particularly with the golf courses, I know, but several other things, and the idea of equity. So I hope you can speak to both of those too.
Absolutely. And yeah, thank you so much for having me, both to the event team and also to Park People and CUI for creating this space for this conversation. My name is Leslie Campbell, and I work alongside an organization here in Toronto called FoodShare Toronto. We, in a nutshell, operate community-led food access programming across the city. That seeks to address food insecurity, especially in communities that are underserved by the current food system, communities like Black, Indigenous, and other racialized communities. We acknowledge that historically the food movement has, and many other movements, including movements around access to public space, have been sort of led by folks who look surprisingly similar. White folks, straight folks, upper middle class folks. And so as a result, the solutions to a lot of the issues of food insecurity and resource access and park space access often don't address the very real barriers that many communities face in their struggle to access the money that they need to buy food or other resources. And so in the food justice work that we do at FoodShare, then we acknowledge systems like colonialism, capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy are some of the organizing principles that are embedded in our current food system and that work together to maintain inequity. And to decide who gets a seat at the table and who experiences the most food insecurity. And so as a result, this means that many of our projects are about partnering with communities and grassroots groups that are led by and serving folks who experience the most food insecurity and multiple forms of oppression. And also, these also happen to be the communities that were hit hardest by the COVID-19 pandemic. And so in response to sort of speak to what work has looked like in the context of COVID, FoodShare has seen the demand from the communities that we work alongside to basically access the food that they needed in this emergency situation. And so we began offering an emergency good food box for the first time, which are fruit and vegetable boxes delivered door to door free of charge to communities of folks facing barriers to food access. And we worked to reassign staff working in programs to be able to support the organization of this new service as the demand ballooned in the early days of the pandemic. And we also have expanded our community work to work alongside over 90 community organizations and mutual aid groups to support the distribution of those boxes, prioritizing boxes for BIPOC folks, migrant workers, people with precarious work, those living on a low income and that sort of thing. And through these expanded partnerships, then we were able to support people doing movement building work as well, and have developed new relationships with groups that we haven't collaborated with in the past. And so part of that has also allowed us to begin supporting an action here in the city of Toronto, advocating for greater public consultation on the future use of city golf course green space, which will hopefully lead to these spaces being made more widely accessible in some way, both during COVID and in the future. And I'm happy to get a little bit farther into those pieces a little later on.
Yeah, again, there's so much there, and it's funny that the conversation we're having here in Toronto is something that folks in Vancouver have just been doing, and I imagine that there's a bit of learning to be done across there. We'll keep chugging along with Sabina. Sabina, if you can speak to a bit of your work and how it's changed. I imagine similar to what we've been hearing. It's not that COVID has created new initiatives, but really that it's shown how important the things that we've been doing are, and how the needs have been exacerbated. But I hope you can speak a little bit to, what you're doing with the Thorncliffe Park Women's Committee.
Thorncliffe Park Women's Committee is a community-led organization, and our focus has been mainly on public space animation, and we came together to revitalize our local neighborhood park. And our neighborhood is considered as one of the landing mats for the immigrants. And we wanted that space to be used by the community, which wasn't, I would say it was very much neglected by the city. So we worked with the city for about 12 years, and we completely transformed the park. And we also engaged the members of the community to use the park as their backyard. And now the park is considered as a community hub where people spend their evening times during good weather in the park, and they wait for these opportunities of engagement that we have been offering for all these years. Like, for example, the community market that we run from May until September, providing the opportunities of engagement for the people in the community, and also providing entrepreneurial opportunities for the newcomers in this neighborhood who are really trying hard to get into the mainstream of getting employment, who have language barriers, who have no work experience. So our market provides that kind of storefront or the platform, and we partner with FoodShare to run this market. Hi, Leslie. And Women's Committee is now a nonprofit organization, and we do not have a core funding. Like today, I am using, we do not have an office space. I'm using the library room, and I'm all by myself. I thought I can be here without wearing mask, but the security guy, he comes in and he tells me, and he's showing me this to wear the mask. So this is the challenging time we are into. And the other programmings that we offer is we run 2 community gardens in the neighborhood. And this year, with all this, pandemic, even the community gardens were closed, and we worked with the Toronto's Food Policy Council. I'm one of the members of the Food Policy Council, and we work with the other members, and got the community gardens open and made it like an essential need for the people during this challenging time, because food is very important. And our community gardens were open, and the city provided, because our garden is in the park space, the city provided the hand washing station, and there were guidelines that were given to the community members who are running the gardens, the protocols that we need to follow when the gardeners come in, and take those precautionary measures of social distancing, which was important. But during for gardening, I think like people come at different timings, and that was not much challenging for us. But this year, all the permits for the market, our market happens in RV Burgess Park, because of this challenging situation, all the permits were canceled. And but again, with the Toronto Food Policy Council, we were able to overcome that barrier too. And farmers market were given, a consideration as they sell produce to the people in the neighborhood, and it was considered as an essential service. So we worked with FoodShare, and we run the Good Food Market. And we were also part of this emergency food boxes that Leslie were talking about. And we distributed about 300 boxes, and we supported 300 families in this neighborhood. We worked with the city and staff of FoodShare to get the permits for the market. One of the biggest challenges for us was to have these vendors at the market who were selling clothing, jewelry, and all. And as our market is not funded, it's a volunteer-run market, and the limited resources we work within. So it was challenging to have that bigger market during this challenging time. So we focused on more of having food at the market, and also offering fresh bread using the tandoor oven at the market. So with some of the challenges with the city, working with Toronto Public Health and all, we got the permit in August, and we started running this a very mini market with bread baking activity and giving out these emergency food boxes. And the other thing that we learned this year, and most of our work is about placemaking, public space animation. It's all outdoors. We had our Rabin programs were cancelled, and we also got the grant through Greenbelt Foundation to run our environmental-based programmings, but because of this challenging time, the fund, the grant was canceled this year. So, and the market, because the market was not happening in the park, we came up with the idea to have the virtual market. This was something very new for us, to also navigate how to use the e-commerce platforms and who is going to do that. Because this year we didn't apply for any grants, we didn't get any funding, so we had to use the volunteers to do that. We tried applying for the grant to United Way, but we didn't get in the earlier stage for this to run the virtual market. We thought it is really important for these families who are in low income, who don't qualify even for the SERB, who are part of our market. And through that online platform, we were able to, it was like a training process, even for the vendors, to take the pictures of their items and send it to us. And we worked with the volunteers and created that platform. And our annual Canada Day events, or everything was all virtually. So it was a good learning experience for us to find out the alternate ways of doing things. And
Sabina, I'm gonna try and pause there. I know it's really unfair to ask each of you to talk about all of the things you do in a few minutes, but I think we'll get into it quickly. I wanted to touch on the points you're making about how the process of permitting or having some kind of core funding and how working with the city can help rather than hinder. And I wonder if, Rebecca, you have a sense of how it works in Vancouver. And there's also been a question in the chat about how parks are managed in other places versus in Vancouver, and how the city can facilitate some of these community ideas.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So the question in the chat, so just that the park board in Vancouver has its own elected officials. Most municipalities, the park and rec system is directed by the city elected officials, whereas ours is directed by its own elected officials. So it just means that we can take a slightly different direction than the city, or it's directed by different elected folks who are specifically looking at how parks and systems enact in a city. And Adam, could you relate the other question?
Yeah, Sabina brought up these points, and so did others, about working with the city for permitting and the regulation process, and also about how there isn't really core funding for a lot of developing these ideas, and it's usually ad hoc. And I wonder if you have any experiences of providing that funding as the city or as the Parks Board to these ideas.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. So one of the funding programs that the Park Board has is the Neighborhood Matching Fund, and it's actually a fund that is specifically designed to fund community-driven projects that go through a community-engaged process, and that's for arts, culture, food, and environmental projects. And Sarah for Hives for Humanity is an ongoing recipient of that fund, actually. And Sarah, maybe you could speak to it from a community perspective, but the idea is that it funds projects. So it's not just that we fund projects like build a garden and there you go, or we give funding to just make a mural. It's that we are actually building funding for artists to facilitate community to come together and express their identity, their stories, their histories, and build connections through the process of doing that project. And that's that there's staff actually there to support that process. And there's actually a community committee that decides where the funding goes. So on both ends, it's community driven, and staff are just there to facilitate the process. And Sarah, if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, So I'll share screen again too, so we can show some images as Ali and I share some story. One of the places that we've been working on for the past 4 years now through support from Parks and the Neighborhood Matching Fund is Cathedral Square Park, which is downtown in Vancouver. And Sabina, some of what you were sharing reminded me of that space, like these neglected spaces, especially when there's so much pressure on parks as like some of the few remaining spaces where folks who don't have a home to be in, who don't have private space are seeking that space in parks, and folks who don't have their own backyard are seeking that connection to nature that I think is so like central to our health and our communities. Parks are really some of the few remaining spaces, and they can also get challenging. And then park rangers are now like support workers and health advocates and housing advocates, and through partnership with community organizations, I think like ours, and with other organizations that are community led and that are working really frontline with community members who are experiencing exclusion from housing and from health and from nature. We can do projects to transform spaces like this. So this is the before photo, which hopefully is obvious. Not a lot going on. It was a lot of blackberry that we dug out and a lot of garbage that we collected with our team here, Mark and Eli and Kevin and Dave. And this is the same-ish angle. This is 3 years later. So we did a lot of work to put in a pollinator meadow. We put in wood chips too, so that we wanted to do this reactivation in a way that didn't sweep aside people who had been using that space, but rather like reached out to them, engaged them in the process, and made sure we left space for people to continue using that park. We're not under the impression that a pollinator meadow is gonna like solve our housing crisis or end the drug war, but we do know that it creates moments for connection and access points for people into supportive communities. So we left spaces covered with wood chips where people could still tent and sleep if they needed to. We talk to those people when we're at the park. And we have our little apiary down here where we keep our bees, through which we can share the honeybees and the connection with those like social insects that are not native, but that when we grow meadows, we create places for all kinds of different pollinators to come in. So a couple of bumblebees here, 2 different species that are found in Vancouver. There are about 56 species of bees in Vancouver, wild bees. Here's another honeybee with a mason bee here. We do seed saving, and those are Ali's hands up there. And I'll leave it on this photo for a bit and maybe ask Ali if you want to share any story about Cathedral and what we've done with this support from the city in this place, and also with the support from the Downtown Vancouver Business Improvement Association, who matched that funding. The neighborhood matching fund is a matching fund. So a lot of partnerships coming together to make this possible, and really using these honeybees that are guests as well, as many of us are guests to this land, to be this access point, so that in this photo, we have art from John W. Sam, who's a carver, a Dene artist in our community, who wrapped eagle and wolf around our hive boxes. This is Fraser with some goldenrod, and Willie, I think, with some peppermint, Ali with that was Pearly Everlasting, Jim with the bouquet, and Ivan, who helps put out tables and chairs there every day. Also in this photo, this is a park bench. And before we started this project, the park benches weren't there, they'd been removed. And it was a really special day when we showed up there and the park benches had been put back in. It felt like, when we pay attention to the land and when we put our love in there, other people start to see that and get inspired by that. And so that so much can be possible when we start, and through partnership and through support from our cities, that so much can be possible in the hands of our community members. Ali, do you want to share anything about Cathedral, like any of the work that we've done up there, or what it's been like for you?
Well, I don't want to take up too much time. I want to hear the other people speak, and I think the pictures speak for themselves. And I know I went to work one day and I did something with my foot, and I was stubborn, and they allowed me to work anyway. I just remember that. So it's been quite a transformation. I never back down when it comes down to working. So I know it's been. I have two couples I know that are homeless there that have, unfortunately, they have to live there because there's no place for them to go, and that's their place, place of sanctuary.
Yeah, and those couples always wave at us when we come in and check in with us and point out what's been gone when we're not there. So yeah, this project has been one of the ways where we, you know, empower the folks that are there to be the stewards that they are, and to give some like acknowledgement to those folks. So last time I was there, some of our friends pointed out a hornet nest that had been living in one of the trees that they'd been keeping an eye on. We show up and people are doing cleanup, you know, collecting garbage or anything that's been left at the park. Like what happens when we say yes to people, and what happens when we meet people where they're at. And that might be Ali on a day with a sore foot, and then she can do seed saving. It might be somebody who is sleeping there, who, if we like share our name and welcome them and maybe offer some food, and offer an honoraria to participate, that we can support people in emerging their skills and emerging their leadership. And nature feels like this, just such a like a tangible way to do that, to like feel our connection, and to grow things with hope for a future that we vision as a place of social and environmental justice.
I think you're definitely right. The photos tell the entire story, and this reimagining, like you both and Rebecca have said, of not just hard infrastructure, but some of the soft infrastructure that, you know, you mentioned how park rangers are now more like community health workers. I think it's a total reimagining. That's really interesting to see. I wanted to give Sabina a chance to talk about this same idea. The tandoor oven is getting a lot of traction in the chat, and I was hoping to give you a moment to talk about how that came to be and how something like that can activate the rest of the community. And then Leslie, I'm going to jump to you after that. Sabina, you're muted, I think, still. Great.
When we started this public space activation, you know, and working with the city, as you all know, it takes a lot of time. The first thing that we got in the park were garbage bins. You know, we celebrated getting the garbage bins in the back. In the park, we did the cleanup and all. So each year we had been thinking about ideas to how do we engage community in the park. In 2008, there was the year that we started all these activities, and we had Arts in the Park programming. And when we approached winter, we thought about how do we bring people outside in winter, and had this winter carnival. And since 2009, we are having this winter carnival every, you know, each year in the month of February, where we gather, where all the residents gather. We have like a bonfire, we make hot soup, hot chocolate, music, and activities for youth and children. And then again, when the good weather comes, we also thought about having cooking events in the park, making variety of bread baking. And our partners and our advocates, I should say, from Dufferin Grove Park, Yuda Mason and Mason Shajadin, they were they had really helped us in, you know, in navigating the city processing, the permits and all. And we started having baking events in the park. And we came up with different ideas of baking bread, and then we thought, like, why not have oven in the park? And all the Toronto parks have either pizza bake ovens or the just the barbecue grills in the parks. So we're looking at the diversity in the community, and also predominantly like South Asian population, we came up with the idea of tandoor bake oven. Why not have tandoor bake oven in our park, which is so unique, and which represents the cultural heritage of the majority of population living here. And also we can bring people from all over the city and all over the province to come and visit the park and see how the bread is made in the clay oven. So that is how the idea came, and we worked with the city and our different partners, even park people, Toronto Food Policy, Toronto Food Strategy folks were involved in making this come real. And it took about 2.5 years to bring the oven to the park. And since then, we had been having this bread baking activities, which is very much engaging. People come together, women share their stories, and they bring their little kids and show that this is how the bread is made. And the children understand that the bread they eat, it's not from, they don't get it from the grocery store, just like that, it's actually being made. So that is how we had been engaging people. And we also bring in, like last year we did try this, bringing the children from the camps at Jenna Jean Murray Community Rec Center, which is in Thorncliffe, to make pizza in the park using the tender oven.
It's so interesting how you talk about the same kind of small win, whether it's a garbage can, whether it's a bench, the basics that allow you to start doing much bigger things. It's funny how that's a commonality. And I know folks are really interested in how you actually work with city staff and how you work with others to do that. So Leslie, I was wondering, you kind of play this intermediary role sometimes between community groups and city staff. And I was wondering if you could share about how you negotiate some of that, and also your take on, how consultation has been important during the COVID pandemic, and how having more folks involved can actually change the way we use our parks afterward.
Sure. Yeah. Happy to speak to that. And I think to do that, I'd like to begin by telling a little bit of a story. And I mean, the first step, I think, is that in the context of COVID and outside of this context as well, we need to just reframe or broaden what we think of as public space or public park space. I think currently when people's minds go to public parks, but our tax dollars also go towards paying for many other spaces that are far less accessible. So for example, in the city of Toronto, there are over 100 golf courses, but there are 7 golf courses that are city run and funded by our tax dollars. But the vast majority of citizens don't access these spaces due to the gates, the fences, and the fees. So, I mean, recently, FoodShare took the opportunity to work alongside a coalition of nonprofit organizations and local community representatives, as well as leaders in the BIPOC-led urban agriculture sector, to advocate for these spaces to be more accessible. It garnered a lot of public interest and attention. Hundreds and I believe thousands of letters were sent into to City Council on this issue. And so, I mean, ultimately, this debate was not about golf courses. It was about how public space in our city is used and who has a say in it and what it's used for, and about ensuring that public land serves the greatest public good. And so after a vigorous debate in City Council this month, then the council went ahead and voted to extend the contracts on these golf courses by 2 years. But in that process of debate, then several motions were passed, which included a commitment to hold public consultations in 2021 and to explore opening these lands for free year-round use. And kind of more immediately then, Council also directed the Department of Parks, Forestry and Recreation here in Toronto to explore options to open up golf courses for potential use in the winter, and also to publicize the fact that like during seasons when no one is golfing in these spaces, then I feel like it really makes sense to publicize the fact that the public should be able to access these spaces. And so, yeah, I mean, in terms of playing an intermediary role there, then I think that that public consultation piece and pushing for that is really important, because historically, public consultations, I think, may not have taken place in all of the kind of open and kind of invitational ways that they ought to have. I mean, I think that we have seen, as Rebecca was speaking to previously, that there is just significant inequity among community access to park space and green space. And so figuring out how to run public consultations in a way that prioritizes the voices of folks who perhaps have not historically been considered in these spaces, thinking about where and when these consultations are held and how to make them more accessible to low income or BIPOC folks, that sort of thing. For example, if a consultation is held in a space where someone must submit to a search before entering, you are less likely to get representation from groups that have a history of experiencing trauma at the hands of law enforcement. And often these pieces are simply not considered because of who is in positions of decision-making power or coordinating the consultation. So, I mean, a lot of the work that we do is to try to advocate to broaden the thinking about how we go about setting up these spaces so that historically underrepresented groups are able to have their voices heard and their priorities represented more accurately in the policy that is made and moving ideally towards kind of a more equitable society for all of us.
I think we could go on about this for another hour, but we are winding down, and I wanted to give everyone a chance to share maybe one final takeaway, something tangible that you think the folks listening can think about as we, build this idea of building back better. I think you've all given examples of how parks and public spaces have really just shown us how valuable they have been and were before COVID. It's not that they've suddenly been reimagined, but that they've been really providing this community hub role for a while. So I wanted to, if anybody has one last final thought to share before we start to wrap up. If not, Sarah, why don't you go for it, and then Leslie.
We've just been asking this question in our work around the Hastings Folk Garden, which is, I'm going to put it up while we share again. This was a panorama we took of all of our folks just recently, kind of spaced out through the garden. This is Hastings Street behind us, the Smiling Buddha Cabaret, where Jimi Hendrix of legend in Vancouver played, and Insights on the other side. And this is kind of a precarious space. It's both the heart of our programming and right in the heart of the community. It's one of the green spaces that really is a green space that isn't like a tree or a carpet that is color green, but actually is growing medicine and growing opportunity, growing connection, offering space for ceremony, offering space for gathering, offering space for people to sit under the fig tree and have a smoke or whatever they need. But it's precarious. We don't know how long it's going to be there. We don't know when the pressure of development, when there's going to go a sign up on the front gate that says this is, under development. And we're trying to work to understand that, but how can we bring more spaces into our parks? How can we bring more spaces especially into communities, like Leslie was saying, that don't always have access, and this inequitable distribution that Rebecca was speaking to. And I just wanted to finish too with thanking Sabina for talking about story. I think it's through story that we grow our connection and our understanding. It's around food that often that space for story is created. And Ali, you've been a storyteller for our family here at Hives, and Ali sits on our community engagement committee, which is a pathway to governance, a pathway to the board of directors from our bees and our gardens, and has been a storyteller there too, sharing story whenever we have the opportunity. So I don't know if you want to finish with any thoughts, Ali, before we pass it over to Leslie.
Well, I would say that it was really great to hear all of your voices. And I think we came together in a good way. And what I would say is, Nate Estelle, we're gonna do good medicine.
Leslie, why don't you finish us off before Molly gives a final word?
Sure, happy to. And yeah, I guess I would also just echo that thanks to all of my fellow panelists for all of the sharing and openness that you've brought to the space. And I think to close, I just wanted to say a quick word, just with all of the conversation about kind of equitable access to public space. I think that it's really important for folks to think about how they might be able to support advocacy priorities outside of your geographic area or your neighborhood. Like we all sort of have power, and that power is not shared equitably among everyone in society. But folks with more power are able to use that power to advocate for the priorities of traditionally underserved neighborhoods or communities. If we acknowledge that this power disparity plays itself out geographically in a city in terms of where most resources are allocated or which neighborhoods' demands are most quickly responded to by the city, if you happen to live in a place that is better resourced with better infrastructure or more access to green space, you can find a neighborhood that isn't. Figure out what folks in that space or from that neighborhood are asking for, and echo and support those demands. Stand alongside or behind those folks and support, use your power to support what they are asking for. And I think that that is the sort of power shift that we are going to need to see if we are going to move toward a society in which we are all able to sort of access the space, the resources, and the what we need to survive and thrive as communities.
Excellent. Well, thank you all. We are hitting 2. So Molly, why don't you just take us home?
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone. I think I echo probably a lot of sentiments when I say that this is a conversation that I felt like could have gone on for another hour easily. And we're really kind of seeing that connection between community, the organizations that support them, and you know, the government, the policies and the practices that are in place. And it seems like we're at a really pivotal moment where we can find ways of working together and really amplifying nature and public spaces and green spaces for communities. So thank you again to our panelists, all 5 of you, for joining us today, and to our audience members as well. I do just have a few final slides if you can stick with me. So we do keep all of our webinars as well as our written resources and our little short summary videos on our COVID and parks resource page. So check that out. We also wanted to give a big thanks to TD Ready Commitment and the Metcalf Foundation and CUI, the TD and Metcalf for funding this webinar series, and CUI for partnering with us, as well as all of our individual donors who continue to support everything that we do. If you would like to make a donation of any amount, you can visit our secure website at parkpeople.ca. We also encourage you to stay in touch. We've got a great newsletter that goes out every month, as well as Facebook pages or Facebook groups and whatnot. We will have the second webinar in this series with CUI that will actually be on Thursday. It's we're going to look at the connection between well-being and park investment. We've got some fantastic panelists for that as well. We're dropping both the French and the English registration links in the chat right now. So thank you again. Please keep in touch. Thank you for allowing us to go over by a few minutes. We are posting a French and English feedback survey. The English one will open automatically and the French one will be in the chat. So please let us know what you thought, how we can do better next time. We're always open to hearing that. And thank you again for being a part of this conversation. We hope that the ideas, the concerns, the motivations presented in today's webinar will help you in your work. And we thank you for the work that you do in keeping your communities connected, inspired, safe. Thanks, and have a great rest of your day.